Okay, I'd like to start talking about ODBC and the use of ODBC with your Fujitsu NetCOBOL for .NET programs. Now, over the course of this particular session, I'm going to show you how to access Visual Studio 2005 in a different way. We're also going to take a look at the integration of SQL Server with Visual Studio 2005. And again, there are a number of different things that I'm going to expose you to in this particular lesson. So I want you to follow along closely because this particular one can be a little bit complex. So instead of going ahead and just double clicking on my shortcut for Visual Studio 2005, I actually have an Explorer window here, a File Explorer window up here. I have this ODBC sample.sln. Anytime you see SLN, you will know that that right there is a Microsoft Visual Studio solution. And if I go ahead and just double click on that, that will cause Visual Studio to go ahead and open up. So what you're going to see here is that since I've got Visual Studio open, and by the way, I'm going to unpin this check-ins here so that I can get that out of the way. You'll see that my program is all up and running here. This is a great example, and this really shows off the ODBC interface. And again, you can see some really cool things with it. So we're gonna go ahead and use this as one of the samples. So looking at this particular one, we've named this class library SQL class is the internal name is FUJSQL, and of course is SQL class.FUJSQL. Now, if you'll go down here to the working storage section, of course, we've got this object reference here for FUJSQL. That right there allows us to reference back to itself. So we'll go ahead and look at this. This is a static method right here. So I've got my static, I've got some working storage, and of course I have my method ID here is called main, and of course I've got my procedure division, and I've got all the various invocations. So I've got one for creating a program and loading a program and reading a whole series of records. This is a sequential read, and then of course I've got a random read. And this junk here is basically a way for us to stop the process and allow you to just press any key because basically we're going to accept whatever from the console. So it'll cause us to press the enter key in order to exit out. The next thing we've got here is an object instance, and again, if you look at this, the FUJ create, we've got a table definition. And if you look at this part right here, you'll see what is arguably the equivalent of DDL, data definition language, for a SQL-based database. This could work in either Microsoft Access, or you could use SQL Server, which is what I've got. And basically, all of this information will be passed as a table definition to ODBC, and a table will be created with these characteristics. So we've got a begin declare here. Again, we have a test here to make sure that the database connects okay. And again, you'll notice SQL state is not equal to 0, and SQL state is not equal to 0001. If there's an error, if it's anything other than this, well, I know that I'd have a bad connection. So again, I've got a drop table, the same kind of scenario where I test for the connection, and of course I execute my SQL, and you can see how all of that works. So that's the end of the create. We'll step through that in a little bit more detail after a bit. Then I've got a load section. So here's another method for SQL to actually use load. So I have method ID FUJ load, and then of course I've got some data declared here. So this is a begin declare, and you need this one so that you can basically load up your variables for your SQL table. I've got some variables out here so that I can capture start times, stop times, and keep track of the amount of time it takes to insert a number of rows of records and that sort of thing. And then of course I've got a standard accept and display to query the end user as to how many records he would like to insert into the table that we've just previously created. And of course we would go ahead and capture the beginning time, and then of course test for the connection, and then just go ahead and run the load. Now what you see here is we're propagating data into the variables here, and we'll go ahead and see all this in just a little bit. And then in this particular spot right here, we're going to actually do an insert of all of these variables into these values right here. So all of these are the SQL values that we're going to be inserting into. And then of course we pick up the stop time and go ahead and press on through the rest of the code. We go through a lot of this sort of data. We've got a Fujitsu FUJ read. we're doing the same thing. Instead of doing an insert records, we're going to go ahead and do a whole series of fetches, and basically we're setting this up to read X number of times, and you'll see how that works. And of course the last one is going to be using a random read, and this is kind of interesting because again we're going ahead and declaring all of the variables out there, and then we'll give it a number of records to read, and then we'll go ahead and use an intrinsic function for random. We randomize the key that we actually go out and pick up, and we read certain records, random records, a certain number of times. And then of course we pick up the times for starting and stopping, and we go ahead and do all of the computations for the amount of time elapsed, and so forth, and then we of course finish. Now before we start running this particular program, there are a couple of things that you need to know about. I do have a database already set up, so if I go ahead and go into my Server Explorer in the Visual Studio, I can come down here and look at my class database. I've got a class database already set up and ready to go. I can look and see if I've got any tables out here, and I don't. So one of the things that you're actually going to see is I'm going to stop processing of this program at a certain point in time and basically say, okay, have I actually got a table out there? And you'll see how I can actually go out and interrogate that table, make sure that it is set up properly, and make sure that I have and insert records in there. I'll go back in there and I'll open the table so that you can actually interrogate or look at the records that were inserted into the database, and then we'll go through and finish the program. Now we've already established that I've got a database set up. It's called class. One of the things that's really important when you start dealing with ODBC is that you need to make sure that you set up an ODBC driver properly, and basically set up a reference for ODBC to connect to the database. And how we do that is I'm going to go ahead and press start down here and come up here to control panel. This is the easiest way to get this done. So I'll go control panel and I'll look at my administrative tools right here, and I'll just double click on administrative tools, and of course I'll look for data sources, which is right here for ODBC. That's the big hint right there. It says ODBC. If I double click on that, you'll see that I've got my ODBC source administrator. This is where you set up your ODBC interface for a given database. And again, it could be DBase, it could be Excel, it could be Microsoft Access. There are all kinds of databases that are available out there. Now, this is a user dataset name. I prefer to use the system dataset name. And as you can see, I've got a number of these out here. Little projects that I've done over the period of time. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new data source. So we'll create the new data source, and again it gives me a whole series of drivers that I can use. If you kind of scroll down here, you'll see that they're Access, Excel, FoxPro, ODBC for Oracle, Paradox. There's pervasive ODBC client interface for B-tree files, for example. I want SQL Server, so I'll go ahead and select that and just say finish. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to name the data source. So it's going to say what name do you want to refer to this always as. So I'm just going to call it default. And again, be careful how you spell all of these things, because it will, if you misspell it somewhere and you're not paying close enough attention, believe me, something won't work and it will rear its ugly head, and you'll have to go back and try to figure out and troubleshoot what all is going on. I'll go ahead and call this the class database. And this is just an informational piece of information for a description. And then the next thing it's going to do is say, okay, well, what server do you want to connect to? And I actually have SQL Server installed on my local machine, so I'll just go ahead and select that, and I'll go ahead and click on next to go to the next panel here. In my particular instance, I have Windows NT authentication set up. Again, it's simple, it's easy, and I'm not doing anything mission critical, but you have some other options in terms of setting up your security for your databases. So with SQL Server, you could have authentication using a specialized login ID and password that are set up inside SQL Server itself, and of course it will also use the Windows NT authentication that you see I'm using here. That's fine with me. I'll go ahead and just click on next. And now I can go ahead to the next data source for this. I want to change the name of the default database to something other than master. So I'm going to come back up here and specify class as the database. Again, because you saw in the Server Explorer, I had class already created for this. Everything else looks good here. All of these are default values here. ANSI quoted identifiers, that's fine. ANSI nulls, that's fine. So I'll go ahead and say next. And then the next thing that it will do is it will say, okay, do you want to do change any of the language? English is the default for me. I don't need any encryption data, or I don't need to perform any translations or anything else like that. All of these values are fine as they are. They're default values. So I'll go ahead and say finish.